The map on the table glowed under the cold lights of the war room, its surface littered with red markers, each one a symbol of violence and fear. 17 camps, 3 heavily fortified training centers, 5 logistical bases funneling supplies across borders like arteries feeding a cancer. Western military officials had spent weeks constructing the plan now projected before the room, an 18-month operation backed by a $2.3 billion coalition effort. The room was quiet, every eye focused on Ibrahim Traoré as the final slide faded. Then came his response, quiet but thunderous in its certainty. We'll do it in 48 hours, and we'll do it alone. There was silence first, then shock. The Western officials blinked, unsure whether they had misheard or misunderstood. But Traoré was already turning to his commanders, young, battle-worn, fiercely loyal, and born of the soil they were about to reclaim. What he didn't explain yet, what they couldn't yet see, was that this wasn't a bold improvisation. It was a strategy born of years watching failure, draped in foreign uniforms and wrapped in foreign budgets. A secret plan had been quietly unfolding beneath the surface, now ready to explode into the most audacious military campaign in modern African history. In the depths of Burkina Faso's military headquarters, surrounded by tactical maps, intercepted communications, and ancestral pride, Traoré's team began drawing new lines across the old paradigms. Where Western forces saw airstrikes, Traoré saw shadows moving silently through the dunes. Where foreign troops needed interpreters, his soldiers spoke the dialects of every tribe. Where others required drones and satellites, his scouts navigated by stars in the curve of ancient riverbeds. Colonel Uriogo, hardened from years of counterinsurgency, leaned forward. If we wait 6 months for them to mobilize, more villages will burn. Captain Sankara, head of intelligence, added, they've never understood this land. They fight against the desert. We were born from it. Traoré stood and faced the map. We're not fighting with their rules. We're fighting with our truths. And so, within hours, Operation Desert Storm was no longer theory. It became breath. It became motion. No armored convoys rumbled through cities. No televised announcements warned the enemy. Instead, 3 units began to quietly assemble in the shadows, the desert shadows. A unit of 200 hunters from the north, trained not in barracks but under the moonlight and silence. These were men who could read tracks like books and smell movement on the wind. They slipped into the outer perimeter of the terrorist zones with nothing more than traditional bows, knives, and instincts sharpened over generations. The mobility, strike team's 500 elite soldiers on desert-hardened motorcycles and modified pickups followed. They moved like a storm, crossing terrain that would mire tanks in sand and defeat radar in dust. The local integration unit's 300 fighters drawn from the very regions under siege formed the final layer. They could tell a villager from a fighter by the way they walked, by the tremble in their voice. These soldiers didn't need translators. They were the translation. All of this moved under a command structure stripped of Western bureaucracy. No waiting for satellite uplinks. No generals hundreds of miles away making decisions with outdated intel. Traoré's doctrine was clear. Commanded initiative. Clear goals. Tactical freedom. Total trust. When the operation began, the desert itself seemed to fall silent. No helicopters, no flares. Only the ancient crunch of footfalls across sand. The desert shadows reached the first camp under moonlight and dismantled it without firing a single shot. Sentinels fell silently. Hostages were secured and guided away through dunes before dawn. Back in the capital, Western military officials arrived for a scheduled follow-up meeting. They were told President Traoré was in deliberations, unaware that the very map they had presented was already being rewritten in blood and liberation. By midday, 11 of the 17 camps had been neutralized. The strike teams had used every feature of the landscapes, dried up wadis, even herders' routes to cloak their movement. Their casualties were minimal. Over 300 civilians were already freed, including children being indoctrinated into jihadist ranks. The enemy, caught in disbelief, tried to rally a counteroffensive. That too had been anticipated. Traoré's commanders had left one path open, an escape route through a narrow valley. Predictably, the terrorists took it. Waiting for them in the shadows were the integration units. The trap closed with finality. By sunset, the last of the resistance had been crushed. Only one logistics base, just beyond the Malian border, remained untouched but with its lifeline severed. It was as good as dead. 48 hours later, Traoré received the final update. Every objective achieved, hostages freed, enemy forces dismantled, intelligence documents, recruitment lists, funding channels all in hand. The next morning, Traoré finally entered the briefing room where the Western delegation waited. The French colonel began to speak, frustration barely concealed, but Traoré raised a folder. Here's the after-action report. Operation Desert Storm concluded 1 hour ago. All targets neutralized, all goals met. Stunned, silence, then disbelief. That's not possible, an American advisor stammered. It is, Traoré replied, just not by your methods. A hush hung heavy in the room, as he explained how his people had achieved what foreign doctrine insisted could not be done. He didn't gloat, he taught. When asked why the coalition hadn't been informed, Traoré answered without venom. Because operational security matters. Because too many of our past missions were compromised before they began. The implication that Western intelligence leaks had doomed African missions before was clear, but no one dared challenge it. As news of the operation spread, the psychological aftershock rippled far beyond the battlefield. In remote villages, where men had been kidnapped and women terrorized, it was Burkina soldiers, not foreign mercenaries, who walked in with food, safety, and reassurance. Western analysts first doubted the numbers, then doubted the methods. But as journalists and satellites confirmed every detail, the narrative shifted. Maybe the Sahel didn't need imported armies. Maybe it needed memory of the land, of the people, of how freedom is won when it is personal. Within months, Mali and Niger began rethinking their own counterinsurgency strategies. Suddenly, the idea of localized warfare wasn't seen as primitive, it was seen as prophetic. For Traoré, Desert Storm was never just a mission. It was a message. A declaration that African nations were done outsourcing their defense, their dignity, and their destiny. In a televised speech days later, he stood not as a general, but as a son of the soil. For too long, he said, they've told us safety comes from beyond our borders, from uniforms not our own. But this desert does not yield to machines. It yields to those who respect it. Our safety comes from our knowledge, our courage, and our refusal to be ruled by fear or dependency. And so, Desert Storm entered history not just as a tactical success, but as a turning point. A point where the world was forced to see that sovereignty isn't granted. It's taken, with sand in your boots, with ancestors at your back, and with the certainty that the land remembers who it belongs to. Where once foreign uniforms patrolled with drones overhead and mistrust in their wake, now it was the whisper of desert boots, Burkina boots, that brought calm to scorched villages. Operation Desert Storm had not just dismantled terrorist networks, it had dismantled the belief that African nations were fated to be arenas of endless intervention. It had proven, with brutal clarity and elegance, that the tools to reclaim safety were not parked in foreign airbases or sealed in NATO crates. They were here, in the language of the wind, in the footprints left by men who knew the scent of a raindrop before it hit the sand. Within months, a leaked NATO assessment quietly circulated among diplomatic circles and intelligence desks from Brussels to Langley. The conclusion was startling in its candor. The operation's success lay not in equipment, but in what the report termed indigenous terrain integration. Familiarity with geography, dialect, and rhythm of life had enabled forces to succeed where precision bombs and surveillance aircraft had failed. This level of localized adaptation, the classified document noted, cannot be replicated through conventional coalition doctrine. But for the villagers of the Sahel, these conclusions were not theory. They were lived truth. Markets that had gone silent for years came alive again with chatter and laughter. Schools that had once taught death chants now echoed with the sound of arithmetic and poetry. The transformation was not just physical, it was psychological. The veil of helplessness that had long shadowed these regions began to lift. When Ibrahim Traoré visited Djibo 3 months after the operation, it was not a triumphant parade. He moved quietly through the market, greeted by elders who had once buried their sons with no hope of justice. One village chief, voice hoarse with emotion, said what no foreign diplomat could ever script. The others came with machines and instructions. They guarded their own lives more than ours. But your soldiers, they knew us. They walked with us. And they stayed. This was the revelation, that security imposed from outside is not the same as security birthed from within, that the scent of home matters more than the flash of imported steel. Traoré took this lesson and carried it beyond warfare. Ministries began restructuring development programs around the same principles: start from within, not above. Schools were reimagined using community elders as curriculum advisors. Road projects employed local knowledge of flood patterns and land memory. Even healthcare initiatives began using herbalists to assist in early detection before reaching hospitals. 6 months after Desert Storm, for the first time in 7 years, Burkina Faso recorded a full month without a single terrorist attack. International observers hesitated. Was it sustainable? Was it real? But as month turned into 2, and then a quarter, the phrase Burkina model began surfacing in policy papers and defense briefings around the world. Unlike foreign counterinsurgency templates based on firepower and GPS coordinates, the Burkina approach emphasized cultural legitimacy, human intelligence, and Tyrene-bonded maneuvering. The most devastating confirmation of its effectiveness came from an unlikely voice. A high-ranking insurgent commander, captured during the operation, gave an interview to Burkina intelligence. Against foreign soldiers, he confessed, we had many advantages. They couldn't tell fighters from civilians. They feared death. Their equipment choked on the sand. But your men, they moved like ghosts who spoke every tongue, who knew where we'd run before we ran. We had nothing against that. How do you fight the wind? That admission, wrapped in reluctant respect, echoed louder than any military review. It exposed a foundational flaw in modern counterterrorism thinking, that superior technology guarantees superior results. Desert Storm proved otherwise. In places where the land itself resists outsiders, the key to security is not domination, belonging. 1 year later, Traoré convened a regional security summit in Ouagadougou not to request aid, but to share the blueprint. Delegations arrived not with donor demands, but to learn. Commanders from Mali, Niger, Guinea, even as far as Chad, gathered around sand-strewn maps and notebooks filled with hand-drawn sketches of terrain and village structures. "We are not offering weapons," Traoré said. "We are offering a shift of philosophy, that we must stop renting safety and begin building it with the bricks of our own knowledge." What began as a military operation had, by its anniversary, become a doctrine, one that crossed into education, infrastructure, even diplomacy. Africa was no longer to be viewed as a dependent client of international security. It was emerging, through Burkina Faso's example, as a potential innovator of solutions designed not in Geneva or Paris, but in Dori, Kaya, and Bobodu. Impact was visible not just in policy, but in posture. The Defense Academy in Ouagadougou revised its curriculum. Cadets now studied cartography not through satellites, but through oral histories and tribal migration routes. Procurement teams prioritized gear that wouldn't break in the bush, that could be repaired by village mechanics, that didn't require software updates from foreign firms. Military doctrine evolved, command structures flattened, giving frontline units flexibility based on live context instead of outdated approvals. 2 years after the operation, Traoré stood before a class of new officers and spoke of the battle not in terms of firepower, but of mindset. Desert Storm, he told them, was never just about terrorists. It was about dependency, about reclaiming our right to solve our own problems. They told us that without them, we'd fail. But we didn't, because we believed in something they never could, that knowing your land is the greatest weapon of all. That belief became institutionalized. Burkina Faso began exporting advisors, not arms, but methods. When renewed insurgency stirred in Niger, it wasn't a call to Paris or Washington that followed, it was to Ouagadougou. And this time, the help that arrived came with no strings, no aid contracts, just understanding. By the 4th anniversary, Desert Storm had achieved something rare in post-colonial Africa, lasting redefinition. No longer was Burkina Faso the desperate recipient of foreign training programs. It was now the teacher. International military schools included chapters titled The Burkina Doctrine, and security journals published studies on asymmetric resilience through local force integration. But for the ordinary Burkinabe, none of this was theory. It was safety, it was silence at night instead of gunfire. It was fields sown again by farmers who had fled. It was mothers walking to markets without fear. It was children, once trained for terror, now trained in mathematics. Traoré, older now, more reserved, less armored in his words, said it best as he stood beside a war memorial in Gorom. They said Africa could not protect itself, that we would forever be guarded by others. But we proved something else, that when we reclaim our own knowledge, when we trust our people, when we move like the wind that shaped our ancestors, we are not just free, we are unbreakable. Years passed, but the memory of those 48 hours in the Sahel did not fade, it deepened. What began as a lightning strike against terror became something far more enduring, a transformation not only of Burkina Faso's security doctrine, but of its very sense of self. The regions once marked in red on that infamous map, long synonymous with violence and fear, had evolved into centers of life. Markets bustled again, children walked to schools, rebuilt from the ashes of training camps, and villages no longer whispered the sound of gunfire in the night. But the most remarkable shift was not visible from a satellite. It was in the psyche of a nation that had once been told it could not stand alone. Unlike past recoveries funded by international donors and patrolled by foreign troops, this resurrection had been seeded and sustained by local hands. What had been achieved wasn't just victory, it was vindication. And the results were undeniable. Economic activity surged in previously abandoned regions, not because of imported consultants or Western-backed infrastructure grants, but because the people had returned, and with them came life. Crucially, all of this had been done while steadily reducing dependence on external security forces. Burkina Faso had proven something the world had refused to believe for generations, that solutions rooted in indigenous knowledge, adapted to local conditions, and centered on communal legitimacy were not only viable, they were superior. The doctrine that had once seemed naive now stood tall as a living example of how strategy could emerge not from the blueprints of foreign generals but from the pulse of a people who knew their land more intimately than any drone ever could. 5 years after those 48 hours, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the entrance of a training compound built on what had once been the largest terrorist base in the region. The same coordinates that had once terrified his commanders were now inscribed above the gates of a school for regional security officers. But this was no ordinary military academy. Here, soldiers from across Africa came not to learn how to imitate Western doctrine, but how to reconnect with their own. The lessons weren't delivered in the language of imported acronyms and Pentagon logic. They were spoken in dialects of survival, in strategies that came from herders, hunters, and old warriors who understood that knowing when the wind shifts matters more than satellite feed. We are not just teaching tactics, Traoré told assembled delegates. We are teaching philosophy. The courage to trust our own knowledge, to build with what we have instead of waiting for someone to arrive with what they think we need. That philosophy centered on African agency rather than aid dependency had quietly become the greatest legacy of Operation Desert Storm. Beyond the clearing of enemy camps, it had cleared something far deeper, the colonial-era assumption that African nations could not solve their own security dilemmas without external assistance. This was not just a shift in methods, it was a shift in mindset, and it echoed far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. 6 years after the operation, Traoré stood before the United Nations Security Council and spoke not as a leader requesting support, but as a voice offering direction. For too long, the global narrative around African security has treated us as problems to be managed. Operation Desert Storm was not just a campaign, it was a declaration that we are capable, that we are not the broken pieces of empire needing repair, but the authors of our own future. Those words reverberated in halls where African leaders had long sat beneath the weight of conditional assistance. Now they spoke with new posture, new precedent. Desert Storm had become more than a moment, it was now a model. And by the 7th year, the world had taken notice. What began as an improvised strategy in a dusty war room had evolved into a codified doctrine across the Sahel. Military academies called it the Sahel approach. It combined local intelligence, terrain-based tactics, and culturally integrated forces not as adaptations of foreign ideas, but as the core methodology. Even urban security teams began to apply its lessons in cities where policing had long failed. And while many global defense experts had initially dismissed the methods as too rudimentary, too backward for modern complexity, it was undeniable. This approach was working. Terrorist networks had not only been disrupted, they had failed to regenerate. Where foreign-led missions left vacuums, Desert Storm left institutions. Where external support demanded resources and created cycles of dependency, Burkina Faso's model ran on self-sustaining momentum. 8 years after the operation, in the heart of what had once been the most contested territory in the country, a new regional development center was inaugurated. Its significance was not in its structure but in its soil. The very soil that had once hosted armed insurgents now grew crops, fueled solar energy, and hosted civil society programs. Traoré, older now, but with the same unflinching gaze, looked over the crowd. What we proved in those 48 hours, he said, was never just that we could win a war. We proved that we already had the tools to build peace. We just had to trust them, trust ourselves. That trust had been the hardest. Victory not over terrorists, but over the quiet belief, hammered into generations of African leadership, that solutions must be flown in from elsewhere. That unless someone from the outside arrived, nothing of value could begin. Desert Storm shattered that belief, and in its place, it built something radical: confidence. By the 10th year, this confidence had begun influencing every corner of national policy, not just in military affairs, but in governance, education, environmental response, and even foreign diplomacy. Where once Burkina Faso's officials arrived at international summits with proposal folders in hand, they now came with frameworks, with tested systems that others came to study. The same deserts that once symbolized lawlessness were now laboratories of resilience. Schools taught cartography with local tools, not imported maps. Public health officers deployed traditional healers to reinforce vaccine confidence. Roads were built by consulting rain elders, not just engineers. And perhaps the most profound moment came on the 10th anniversary of Operation Desert Storm. Traoré stood before a new generation of officers, not in a capital city, but in a village, once occupied by insurgents. The children sat in uniforms their parents had once worn in fear. He spoke not of battles, but of belief. They told us it would take 18 months and billions in foreign aid. But that wasn't just a miscalculation of resources. It was a miscalculation of us, of our knowledge, of our understanding of our land, of our will. The greatest victory of Desert Storm, he said, was not defeating our enemies. It was defeating the idea that we needed someone else to win. And with those words, he closed the book on a decade not just of military reform, but of sovereign awakening. Where the world once saw Africa as the final frontier for intervention, Burkina Faso had become the first light of self-determined security. What had begun as red dots on a satellite map had transformed into blueprints for a new kind of power, not imported, not loaned, not taught, but remembered. Because in the end, Desert Storm was never about the battle. It was about the inheritance, the reminder that African lands, African knowledge, and African people are not waiting for solutions. They are the solution. All they needed was the freedom and the faith to act on it. Asterisk.